Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Michael Yarochi. I'm Associate Dean of Arts and Humanities here at UC Berkeley, as well as a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. And I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's conversation, The Unclassical Homer. Tonight we have two scholars who rethink Homer and the Odyssey beyond their traditional place in the classical canon. They ask how the Odyssey has been reshaped in post-classical contexts, from contemporary theory to art and culture. And they look at what happens when we challenge the idea of Homer as a fixed origin. This topic feels especially timely as we wrap up our first Arts and Humanities Book Club series on the Odyssey this month. I'm sure several of you here have attended those sessions, and we were blown away by the enthusiasm of this group and how excited our alumni are to dig into these texts. Now we're going to explore the idea of Homer himself with two of our distinguished faculty, James Porter and Mario Telò. James Porter is Irving Stone Professor in Literature and Distinguished Professor in Rhetoric at UC Berkeley. His scholarship spans classical antiquity, modern philosophy, and critical theory, and his recent book, Homer, The Very Idea, reflects his ongoing interest in classical reception and the enduring, evolving figure of Homer. Mario Telò is professor in rhetoric, comparative literature, and ancient Greek literature. He's the editor of numerous collections of essays and the author of 8 monographs, including, I'll just mention a few, Archive Feelings, A Theory of Greek Tragedy from 2020, Greek Tragedy Through a Global Crisis, Reading Through Pandemic Times, 2023, Roman Comedy Against the Subject, 2025, and more recently, Edward Said and the Late Animal, Classics, Negative Dialectics, and the Limits of Humanism, which is forthcoming from Oxford University Press this fall. So very excited to have both of these scholars here tonight. And lastly, a bit of housekeeping. We're going to keep the audience muted so we don't experience any unnecessary background noise. And we're recording this talk to be able to share it with anyone who couldn't attend tonight. Professors Porter and Telò will both give about 10 minutes or so of overview of their research, and then we'll invite you to submit questions in the chat for our panelists to discuss. So feel free to submit questions through the chat. One of our staff members will compile them, and we'll get to as many as we can after our professors speak. So without further ado, Professor Porter, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. I just want to make sure you can see the slide that's on there. Okay, good. Welcome, everybody. And since time is short, I'm just going to start right in. The title of our presentation is The Unclassical Homer. You may be wondering what we mean by this. In what way could Homer, the father of Western poetry and the earliest recorded literary source from antiquity, be anything but classical? There's no question that Homer enjoyed this status from around 700 BCE, when the two monumental epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are thought to have taken the form they currently have. The evidence suggests that the two poems, originally produced for oral performance and in piecemeal fashion as separate episodes, were gathered together and committed to writing, possibly by dictation, and attributed to the name Homer. But all this is a complete mystery. As you might imagine, mystery only produces mystique. And it was here that Homer's iconic status was forged. Homer was not simply a poet. In Greek, he was called the poet, ho poetes, a kingly attribute that no other Greek or Roman poet, not even Pindar, Sophocles, or Virgil, could claim. He was more like a god than a human being, and he remained thus into the 19th century, when the French neoclassical artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres displayed his massive apotheosis of Homer in the Louvre in 1827. All of history is shown in the canvas, celebrating Homer's coronation as a godlike poet. The title and the theme were a quotation from a Hellenistic relief sculpture by Archelaus of Priene. Homer, sceptered and enthroned, is in the bottom left corner. Zeus and the Muses are above. Gallistruzi's etching from the time of the work's discovery is a clearer rendition of the worn marble. Here is a detailed view of Homer. In Angra's painting, Homer's visage was taken from a Roman copy of a Hellenistic sculpture that was likewise on display in the Louvre at the time. His posture was borrowed from Archelaus and from Angra's earlier portrait of Jupiter and Thetis. Angra's Homer is a composite of several unknowns, a virtual identikit, which is what Homer always was. Though often held up as a god, Homer was also recognized to be a mere mortal, frail, replete with faults, and vulnerable to challenges of all kinds. He was blind. How could he see and what could he know? He was said to be a plagiarist, and not the first to sing of Troy and of Odysseus's homecoming. Pre-Socratic philosophers knocked him off his pedestal for telling childish myths about the past and for being an all too human creature. Heraclitus derides Homer for having been stumped by three fisher boys who put to him a riddle that he could not solve. Embarrassed, the aged Homer stumbled in the mud and died 3 days later, covered in ignominy. Plato banished Homer from his ideal city. In the Roman period, Lucian portrayed a long-dead Homer being ferried to the underworld by Charon. On the way, Homer grew seasick, and he vomited up bits of his verses, which Charon dutifully gobbled up, lest they should perish. Mocking and belittling Homer thus became a tradition in its own right, one that paralleled the hagiographic tradition of Homer, as the hagiographers knew all too well. Witness, you can see the mice nibbling at Homer's papyrus scroll below his footstool, suggesting the hazards of time. Looking back, we can say that the ancient world produced two Homers, not one. The first was the ideal in classical Homer. The second was what we are calling the unclassical Homer. How can we account for this double heritage? One way is to realize that antiquity never knew who Homer was. The survival of his poems, each the size of a hefty novel, and appearing seemingly out of the blue, was too good to be true. The perplexity around Homer led either to the hagiographic tendency or to endless doubts and skepticism. Was he a person or a text, an individual or a tradition? The same bifurcation surfaced in modernity. Following Vico and later Nietzsche, we can say that Homer is none of these things. He is just an idea in our minds that has no verifiable referent. Idea of what? At a minimum, Homer stood for a vanished antiquity, a heroic past, a cradle of culture, an irrecuperable loss, or mythical story that never happened. One tendency led to the desire to lay claim to the Homeric heritage in all its original purity. This was quite plainly a fantasy, a hedge against what one knew but dared not acknowledge. Remember the mice in Archelaus's apotheosis. Classicism here takes the form of disavowal. The other tendency was used to critique the idea of Homer for being just that, a fantasy turned into a fetish object that was made to underwrite any number of ideological values, starting with the privileging of Greek political and cultural supremacy in antiquity, and then, by extension, to the rest of the European civilizations at the expense of non-Western civilizations, and above all, the Semitic Near East. A later turn led to fascist appropriations of Homer in the mid-20th century, when the racism and anti-Semitism that unfortunately lay at the root of much of the classicism from the previous century raised its ugly head. It is here that the unclassical Homer comes back into play. Nietzsche's questioning of the classical ideal, represented by Homer and as propagated by Winckelmann, Goethe, and Schiller, paved the way. And then, in the early 1940s, an unlikely group of French and German writers, many of them Jewish, turned to Homer to critique the Nazified version of the classical ideal, according to which the Homeric Greek heroes represented a primordial, blonde-haired Nordic race waging war against a barbarian other. All these writers sought to disenchant the modern image of Homer, or the contemporary one. Erich Auerbach, a Romance philologist exiled to Turkey in 1936 for being a Jew, is the best known of these writers. There he wrote Mimesis, a collection of essays begun in 1941 and published in 1946. The opening chapter polemically identifies Homer's Odyssey with the fascist propaganda and myth-making about the Homeric past that flourished under National Socialism. The contrast he sets up is with the Hebrew Bible, whose authority was being erased by German theologians from the time, but whose historicity, realism, and markedly unclassical qualities he revalidates. Rachel Bespelov's essay on the Iliad likewise dared to compare the Hebrew Bible with Homer, much to the advantage of the Bible. In 1941, Theodor Adorno devoted an excursus to Odysseus in a scathing critique of the so-called enlightened modern world that was now, he wrote, radiant with triumphant calamity. His ambivalent hero was Odysseus, whom he pictured as a wandering Jew. The perversity of the move is subtle but effective. If the German establishment wished to see itself in archaic epic, it would have to gaze upon an unwanted reflection of itself, that of a Jewish Odysseus. James Joyce had already led the way with his Ulysses. Simone Weil's The Iliad, or the poem of force, published in 1941, belongs here too, not for its defense of the Jews, but for its critique of epic violence. In each of these cases, the classicized Homer is being targeted for its support of noble simplicity and quiet grandeur, and for its disavowal of the seething violence that roils through the two poems. I will close with a brief illustration from Erich Auerbach. Chapter 1 of Mimesis turns on the foot-washing scene from Book 19 of the Odyssey. Representing a moment of recognition in the narrative, the scene is almost also a moment of thinly veiled, but easily overlooked, murderous aggression. Odysseus has just arrived home in Ithaca disguised as a beggar and seeking revenge. The aged Eurycleia, his childhood nurse, begins to wash his feet on orders from Penelope. As Eurycleia sets to work, the identifying scar on Odysseus's thigh comes to light. She immediately cries out for joy, nearly thwarting his plans by exposing his actual identity. Auerbach describes what happens next. Even in the dramatic moment of recognition, Homer does not omit to tell the reader that it is with his right hand that Odysseus takes the old woman by the throat to keep her from speaking, at the same time that he draws her closer to him with his left, threatening her with death if she overturns his plans. Then comes a long digression about the origin of Odysseus' scar. For all its heightened danger and drama, the scene as a whole, Auerbach writes, is scrupulously externalized and narrated in leisurely fashion. The narrative surface and Homer's style are not only at odds with what they convey, but they also actively work to redirect attention away from it. Homer makes us forget our own reality for a few hours with his enchanting verses. Between battles and passions, adventures and perils, the poems bewitch us and ingratiate themselves to us with their savory present and fairy tale lack of realism. Classicism here is exposed as a disavowal of its hidden core of violence, which has been reactivated under the Third Reich in a singularly pernicious form. Auerbach's reading is dark, but it helps us to remember that there is much darkness in Homer as well. How we account for it is now up to us. That's the end of my comments, and I am very happy to introduce to you my esteemed dear colleague, Mario Telò.
Okay, so thank you so much, Michael, for the introduction and for making this possible. And thank you so much, Jim, for your nice words and your wonderful talk. My unclassical Homer is grounded in an effect of juxtaposing, reading alongside each other, a filmmaker, John Acanfra, and the singer/poet Bob Dylan, both deeply invested in the evocative power of the Odyssey for modernity. My goal is to demonstrate some of the consequences of reading the ancient and modern together and address the uncanny effects of this intermingling. Sir John Acanfra is a Ghanaian-born British artist, writer, film director, and screenwriter whose commitment to a radicalism both of politics and of cinematic form finds expression in all his films, as we read in his Tate Modern profile. Programmatically engaging with the Odyssey, his 2011 film, The Nine Muses, is an archival and anti-archival experiment in which Alaska's frozen landscape registers as a pristine world before the world, or perhaps after it, in the aftermath of an eco catastrophe. The sedimented whiteness is the apparent object of the gaze of two hooded, masked Odyssean explorers who sail and trek through an unrelenting storm, metaphorically legible as anti-blackness, while highlights of the Odyssey, along with other texts, are recited in a voice-over, most notably the poems opening Andrepoim enne musa polytropon osma polla, Muse speak to me now of the resourceful man who wandered far and wide. Odysseus is an explorer, a figure of the settler or the colonizer, a characterization we see, for example, in the Polyphemus episode, but he's also an exile, a migrant, a defaced man. In a moment of a conference film, the whiteness of the frosty landscape merges with the white foam of a kitchen sink where a black dishwasher stands, and also with the various uniforms worn by a group of black workers. In another moment, the orientation of the two explorers, their backs turned to the camera against the objectifying gaze of viewers and readers, is reflected in the position of two black men looking at a wall inscribed with the racist motto, "Keep Britain White." Treating the Secones, the Cyclopes, and other inhabitants of lands on the path of his wanderings as savage and unlawful, as human and non-human commodities to conquer and extract from, as we see in an artwork of Romar Bearden, Odysseus is the model of the modern colonizer. And yet, the fact that he is unafraid of giving up his identity, calling himself nobody, in the Cyclopes episode, also places him at the opposite edge of the divide between colonizer and colonized. We can cite the Nobel Prize winning Caribbean poet Derek Walcott's assimilation of Odysseus to, in his words, a moving sail, not a ship, but something small on a large expanse of water trying to get somewhere. Homecoming often amounts to going nowhere for Odysseus, and sometimes one cannot say whether going home is what he actually wants. In the Nine Muses, the landscape is indifferent to the person who is unable to absorb it, who remains uncannily detached from it as an alien, like a migrant who experiences dislocation and struggles to understand where he or she is and why. The viewer might think of overcoming the sense of paralyzing dread circulated by the all encompassing glacial atmosphere through a counter apocalyptic event, a rupture in the desolate landscape marking the beginning of a novel or genuine life. This rapture could be something like the revelation of the faces of the Odyssean explorers, which the film never concedes. In a sense, the face is never fully revealed in Homer's Odyssey either. Let us remember that Odysseus' name, the primary marker of identity, a kind of verbal face, is revealed in the prologue only around line 20. The fact that we are kept in a condition of suspension in a guessing game says a lot about this poem's problematic relationship with individuation, definition, and identification. In a Canfra's film, the two figures with their hidden faces reproduce and ironize the man in Caspar David Friedrich's famous work painted in 1818, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, a symbol of the romantic transcendental subject of the tension between the human illusion of mastery of knowledge and the sublime pleasure of falling into the abyss of non knowing, of no return. Yes, in the prologue of the Odyssey, we are told that many were the men whose cities Odysseus saw and whose minds he learned. But when it comes to the sea or even his home, can he really know them? That is, can he comprehend them, which would mean, in a sense, to capture and objectify them? Is the knowledge that Odysseus seemingly acquires compatible with his many turns and returns, is continuing to turn around and perhaps away even when he has returned? Tiresias' prophecy in Book 11 tells us that after he makes it home, he will eventually head back to the sea. Acanthra's Alaskan mountains, haughty and majestically self-sufficient, seem to be about to collapse into the water they overlook and dominate. Or we might alternatively be reminded in the Odyssey of the fate of the Phaeacians, the inhabitants of a utopian world, an unworlded world whose prophesied burial under a mountain is an apocalyptic figuration of what Jacques Lacan calls the drama of symbolization, of being thrown into the trauma of language and linear historic time. In Bob Dylan's Blowing in the Wind, the imagery is charged with Odyssean overtones. How many years can a mountain exist before it is washed to the sea? Yes, and how many years can some people exist before they are allowed to be free? The beginning of the song, how many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man, is focused on a man, a male individual left unidentified. It allows us to connect the Odyssey's poem with the condition of a Canfra's black man afflicted by exhaustion amid his ambulatory persistence. Additionally, in the Odyssey section of Dylan's 2016 Nobel lecture, we notice the fascination and self-identification with Odysseus, who ventures, Dylan says, into the narrow straits with foaming whirlpools that swallow him. The title of the song, Blowing in the Wind, seems itself to be nested in the final words of the speech, in which Dylan addresses himself as Odysseus. You too have rambled this country all around, and you have also felt that ill wind, the one that blows you no good. In the voice-over of a Canfras film, the Odyssean explorer and perennial migrant is sometimes conflated with Telemachus, Odysseus' son, the last hero in Richard Martin's phrase. In Martin's words, Telemachus has his own small adventure story, the goal of which is to gain fame as well as information. But we cannot fail to notice that he, at the end of the poem, is back in a subordinate position. The collapse of the natural world that one may see hinted at in Acanthra and Dylan resonates with the dissolution of the heroic age depicted in the epic poetic tradition, and also by extension the end of Mycenaean civilization, which has been imputed to an overdetermined ecological catastrophe. Tiresias's prophecy to Odysseus, death will come to you from the sea, reaches beyond the Homeric poem, foretelling the movement away from the land of rocky Ithaca into a fugitive space where Odysseus can return to being nobody. Metis in Greek, which alternatively means cunning. As an unlocatable subject, lost in the oceanic, he might be elementally liberated from the constraints of identity, the burden of the heroic, and the imperative to occupy a place unmovable as a snow-capped mountain like the one Hector is compared to in Iliad 13. For the black man assimilated assimilated by Acanthra to Odysseus, this flight to the sea, we might surmise, signifies the washing away of the present world with its hierarchies of human and non-human, an exit from the position of a non-subject, a defaced body who is called to occupy the realm of nothingness or non-being. It might intimate the relocation into a manner of being in which Metis, cunning but also nobody, becomes tis, that is somebody. Nobody becomes somebody, or rather anybody able to access not just a bounded identity, but an indefinite existence without predicates. Is this existence without predicates a version of Odysseus's life with Calypso, the goddess of hiddenness, who lives on a hidden island, a land on the edge of the imaginable world where the poem begins? In Dylan's Desolation Row, we read of Calypso singers laughing at the poets Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. Calypso herself, the aquatic nymph abandoned by Odysseus, we could say, stands for elemental elusiveness, for the recalcitrant solitude of escaping the row, for water as an unbound archive. Is Calypso perhaps Odysseus's most Odyssean manifestation, a refusal of revelation or self-revelation, that is of apocalypses, which means revealing or uncovering? Perhaps this refusal of apocalypses, this titillating refusal of revelation, is a seductive yet disturbing legacy of the classical and unclassical Odyssey. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you both for those wonderful comments. Super rich, super suggestive, go in a lot of directions. It seems that both of you are working with the idea of Homer and Homeric texts as stories that both belong to their time and to every subsequent time that engages them and reactivates them, whether it's the reception history, Jim, that you're talking about, or a Comfra's or other artists' engagement with Homeric ideas and themes. So I just thought I'd ask a couple of questions for our audience, which is maybe about the discipline and how Homer is taught today. Is there still a very conventional approach, which is kind of historical, or what are the different lines of approach to Homer in kind of academic inquiry today?
Maria, why don't you speak to that because you're closer to the way Homer is taught in classics departments, perhaps, than I am.
Well, I must say that it's really not possible, I think, to teach Homer as an ancient artifact by detaching it from modernity. I think that if we want to establish that dichotomy, we are somehow deluded. We are not considering the fact that what we consider an ancient artifact as separated from its modern reconstructions and construction is actually fantasy. So it's not possible really to isolate the Odyssey or the Iliad from its recreation. So in my teaching, for example, I try to model an integration of the reading of the text of the Iliad and the Odyssey with Walcott, with Acanfra, and also with less highfalutin, perhaps, recreation of his text, like Andrew Greer's, for example, recent novel called Less, which is an engagement both with the Odyssey and with Joyce's Ulysses. So there is a game of stratification that I don't think can be avoided, not even when we are focused on the historical reconstruction of the civilization that we want to see behind this textual product.
I'll just add two words. One is, or one word perhaps. I also would approach Homer through I guess you would call it a reception history, it's impossible to separate the discipline of classics from that history itself. It is part of, it's just the most recent version of a certain kind of reception of Homer from antiquity. It's an inherited uh, trope that the classics departments necessarily absorb and reconstruct. So, okay, I'll just leave it at that. I had another thought. I'll come back to that in a second. Oh no, one other thing, which is that there are a great deal of it's impossible at the same time to dissociate political understandings, for instance, Hannah Arendt, from Homer. Homer's been extraordinarily fruitful in helping us rethink principles of democracy, of force, of public appearance, of hidden appearances, like we see in the case of Odysseus, where his face is turned away. So it's been such a suggestive. Homer's been such a suggestive element in the academy that it's impossible not to take advantage of that in the classroom.
Okay, great. So a kind of related question or set of questions is coming from folks who've just listened, who wonder what suggestions you would have for teachers engaging students with Homer's works in, like, for the first time. What would be some of your suggestions for approaches to teaching Homer?
Well, maybe I'll start. I think if there's any lesson that we've been trying to convey today, it's not to worship Homer, not to put him on a pedestal and create this kind of, as Mario was saying, a divide between the present and the past, but also the notion of a pure, pristine past. So do not go the route of classicizing Homer, but rather treating Homer as um, uh, something, as an object that cannot be is simply has to be seen around, seen through. How does Homer help us see the way the world is in more complex ways than simply idealizing the past? There is a common way of reading Homer as somehow walling off an epic past from the present, but Homer was not walled off from the present in any way. He was contaminated in so many ways by the present, and so were his first audiences. So there's a kind of parallax and maybe a hiatus that exists, and I think focusing on that by itself would be an interesting approach to try and understand Homer rather than focusing on what lies behind that wall.
Yeah, did you want to add anything, Mario?
Yeah, no, but this is just an observation that picks up on what Jim just said. So I would say that when I teach this text, my approach is always to try to show the students that in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, there is the construction of a certain discourse, which we are all familiar with, but there is also a construction of a counter discourse. So the Iliad is the poem that codifies what is being called the heroic code and a certain humanistic valorization of what we can call heroic masculinity, but there is also a strong problematization of that code, of that discourse that we see everywhere, that we see pushing against the ideology that is being formed. And the same happens for the Odyssey. This is not just the poem of homecoming and consequently of reestablishing some kind of identity, but it's the poem of not knowing whether you actually want to go home, and it's the problem of the drama of identity and of human identity. So there is a kind of disidentificatory discourse in the Odyssey. There is a counter-identitarian discourse. There is a kind of valorization of opacity, that we say from the what we can see from the very first word, which is an indefinite, right? It's a man, and then, as I said, the name is not introduced until line 20. So I would say discourse and counter discourse always.
Great. Yeah. Another thing I was struck by that I don't know whether it was planned or not, but in both of your presentations, you have uh, re-engagements with Homer that really kind of are inflected through the lens of racial violence, right? Both in A Confra and in your paper, Jim. And I'm just wondering if you had some thoughts about what the Homeric tradition, what its legacies are for thinking about violences of all kinds of in all kinds of ways.
That's a great question. First, following up on what Pare just said, an interesting way to think about Homer is not as a heroization of warfare, but rather as a critique of war. In many ways, Homer is a kind of anti-war poet. The other, think about the Iliad focuses around a hero who sits out the war, who contests the very premise of why the Greeks are fighting in Troy. Then the other point to bring out would be perhaps the role of women in a dominated society. So racism, the racialization of the Trojans is an after effect of Homer. It comes later in the way in which the probably Athenian democracy read Homer when it was fighting against Persian barbarians. That didn't exist in Homer's time. There was no sense of a racial othering. The Trojans speak the same language as the Greeks. They worship the same gods. So something happens along the way where Homer becomes ideologically laden and very problematic. So getting beyond that kind of reading is really quite important.
Yeah, and so I guess I'll add something that concerns specifically the Odyssey, since Jim talked about the Iliad. Well, people have suggested that in book 9 of the Odyssey, the Polyphemus episode, there is some kind of reflection of the historical reality of colonization, and that is a good argument. And I would say that not only does Odysseus behave and speak like a colonizer, like a settler colonialist, we can say, but one can even read between the lines some critique of that attitude. So one may be, tempted to think that what we call the intentio textus or the intentio auctoris, the kind of point of view that we are supposed to align ourselves with is, with Odysseus, so is colonialist, but I think that actually, even in thinking in somewhat intentionalist terms, we can see elements of a critique, of a mockery, of the attitude of Odysseus, who goes into the cave of Polyphemus and helps himself and transgresses, the code of xenia, the code of hospitality that he considers himself the most loyal representative of. So when we see him criticizing the Cyclopes for not knowing law, for being beneath the law, uh, actually we see him transgressing the law. So he's really reenacting avant la lettre Derrida's idea that there is no distinction between the beast and the sovereign when it comes to the law, because one is just above and the other one is beneath, but neither one actually, respects it.
Hmm.
So, and that obviously has strong political implications that we can't even start, developing here.
Okay, great. Thank you. More questions from the audience. Here's one that I'm sure lots of people have been thinking about. Christopher Nolan's upcoming film, The Odyssey, seems poised to become a major global reinterpretation of Homer for contemporary audiences, complete with debates already emerging around casting, historical authenticity, cultural representation. And the question is, how do you see blockbuster adaptations like this participating in the continual remaking of Homer?
Mario, I'll let you start off with that.
Well, I think that I don't have, I mean, it's a blockbuster, but I don't have any prejudice against it. So I will go and I will watch it. And, I don't want to make any, I'm not the kind of person who is prone to make any judgments on a work of art. I'll just try to apply my own interpretive hermeneutic attitude to it and see what can emerge. I'm sure that there will be things in it that are going to allow me to see things in the Odyssey that I haven't seen before. So I will go there with an open mind because there is always this possibility of looking back that a new version gives us. I know he has made some interesting and bold choices in terms of casting, of the actors. So I'm also interested in that.
I haven't followed the new film, but I'll go, of course, when it comes out. Films like this have a double barrel effect. On the one hand, they do bring us some interest to in classical topics again, which is wonderful. I hope at the same time that will drive people to look at translations of Homer and begin to read him more closely rather than simply absorb a Hollywood version. Although a Hollywood version of Homer, although Christopher Nolan would probably not give us just that, but I haven't followed the debates.
Okay, great. So there's another set of questions that is real. I think we're touching on it implicitly in some ways, but it's kind of like again thinking of young readers and talking to new readers of Homer about the relevance of Homer or why Homer today. And the question is really coming from people who teach, but it's also a question of like, well, what is it in Homer that makes that corpus so continually reworked and re-engaged? And so it's almost how do we understand that, right? That it's Homeric texts that have this long history of continual reworking. Thoughts about that?
The it factor of Homer is baked into the whole tradition of Homer. So of course there's a kind of immediate attraction to something which is the oldest piece of literature that we have in the West. It turns out to be, if you look closely, one of the most complicated pieces of literature that we have as well. So Homer continue is like a gift that never ends up giving. It continues to give us new readings of himself, and we change in relation to it. Um, but at the same time, I think it's important to ask questions about Homer, how Homer gets used and read, and by what kinds of audiences. It's one thing to look at the way fascist readings of Homer evolved and why they did, and was that something that was prompted by something in the text itself? On the other hand, what is the attraction for someone like Derek Walcott that Mario was pointing to, his Omeros, which is such a fascinating work? And so my hope would be that young students would look at both a modern text and an ancient version, or rather, I would say a modern text in an ancient version rather than a modern text in an ancient text in a modern version, and try to break down that kind of priority or preeminence of the original, if one could.
Yeah, so that's a very difficult question. And I would just say that in antiquity, Homer was, not just in antiquity, but later also, Homer was considered some kind of encyclopedia, was considered a text that contains a multiplicity of other texts, a kind of super genre. So and of course, the Odyssey has become the paradigm of the novel, as such. So, in a sense, it's impossible to write a novel without engaging with the Odyssey, even if you have never read the Odyssey. In a sense, every time you conceive of a story, you are producing your own version of the Odyssey. So we are reading and rewriting the Odyssey, even if we don't know that. And so, in terms of I don't want to present these poems, as totalitarian constructions or all-encompassing worlds when I say that they contain everything, but they do contain a very, wide-ranging, view of society and politics that can resonate so much with us. Let's just think that the hero of the Iliad, Achilles, the symbol of heroic masculinity, is in a queer relationship with Patroclus, a relationship that cannot be defined, but that is homosexual. That's something definitely to consider. And I'm sure, and that I know because when I teach this text, I know that students are really interested in this. And we talked about colonialism and race. So definitely, these are texts that never stop talking, about and to the present.
That's great. It reminds me of the Italo Calvino quote of a classic is a book that has never finished saying what it has to say, as a kind of trying to grapple with that. Um, so another kind of question. Let's see. Let me find. Uh, Getting to audience questions. Um, is maybe the flip side of the question of making it relevant? How important is it, do you think, to kind of enjoin readers to experience the otherness of Homer or its distance from us in the kind of engagements that you're thinking of?
Yeah. Very, very hard to do for us because if we read the epics as novels, as we are tending to do, then naturally we try to imagine our way back into the past. I think the best way to um, alienate ourselves, as it were, from Homer is just to teach Greek to students. And that would be the beginning of a journey because there's nothing like reading Homer in the original. It sounds completely different from any other poetry that we have. And just even the shape of the letters on the page will naturally remind you that you're dealing with a very archaic piece of literature. The mystery about Homer also is a form of alienation as well. We just don't know where these poems came from. We do that with novels. We always have an identifiable author, but with Homer, we can't actually place them in any particular way. So bringing that out, I think, is a good way of creating some kind of useful friction between the present and the past, rather than an identification. Just a
Great.
few thoughts.
Super.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Mario.
No, please, no, no, no. I want to.
Okay, this sounds like it's a little bit like right up your alley, Jim, which is what is the evidence for a single person Homer versus some anonymous agglomeration of writers?
Uh, There is no evidence for a single person named Homer. That's the problem. There are lots of speculations in antiquity, and that's like the ancients were throwing darts at a dartboard, but they couldn't actually hit it. So it's very difficult to imagine, even for ancients, to imagine a work that doesn't have a single author. But in fact, these poems were just circulating in song-like form for generations, for a thousand years probably. So where did this come from? I think, um, well, here then I'm going against what I just said. There's a natural inclination to try to put an author behind a text, and that's what the ancients did. They fell right into that trap. But that's something that we can remind ourselves of. So they suspected that there was no individual Homer. They wrote a number of lives about Homer. So they gave him a biography, but each biography was different. And he was born in 7 different places. No one person could possibly have been born in 7 places, which shows us that even the ancients were aware that they didn't actually know who Homer was. So it's um, where he comes out, I don't know whether I can't remember where the first mention of Homer is, but it's sometime in the 6th century. Certainly by Heraclitus's time. Heraclitus may be the first person to name Homer, but I may be wrong. Um, uh, um, so it was established by a convention.
Great. Okay. So there's also here, all right, here's a question that's kind of gets into death-driven readings of Homer as attempts to diminish the historical distance between us and Homer, and how this relates to the divination of Homer that promotes imperialist agendas.
Oh, that sounds like a Mario question. Death Drive.
Um, well, I don't think I understood entirely the connection between death-driven reading and imperialism.
Let me read it as it's come to me.
Sure.
How does death-driven readings of Homer as attempts to diminish the historical distance between us and Homer relate to the divination of Homer that promotes imperialist agendas?
Well, so I'll just say this, that saying that we are implicated in the interpretive act of Homer, recognizing our situatedness, and consequently saying that modernity is implicated with antiquity, does not mean in any way erasing the gap between antiquity and modernity, but it means, on the other hand, to come to terms with that gap. It means that there is no attempt to build a kind of epistemic mastery through the interpretation of Homer. So it is, I would say, anti-imperialistic, to be aware of our situatedness, making it relevant to the interpretive act, and be aware that our hermeneutic efforts are consequently entangled with failure. They are always partial. They are always experiences of opacity. They are experiences of indeterminacy. And that should not, scare us, but that's how literature works. And there is a political dimension to accepting this.
Okay, I think that is going to be the last word on Q&A because boy, the time has gone by quickly. I want to thank Professors Porter and Telò for such an engaging conversation and for helping us see how Homer continues to be reimagined across times, cultures, and contexts in ways that still resonate today. I also want to thank all of you for joining us and for your thoughtful questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, but I hope you got a good sense of what was out there. As this is our final event of the academic year, we're grateful that you chose to spend your evening with us. This series has been such a success, and we're excited to announce that we'll be continuing with 3 new lectures the next academic year. So keep your eye on your email in the coming months as we announce our next slate of faculty lecturers. In the coming days, we'll send a few follow-up emails along with a link to support our fund for faculty in arts and humanities. This is a fund it's a fund that's one of the best tools we have to keep our great professors here and ensure their work is supported. If you're able, we hope you'll consider making a contribution to help sustain the exciting teaching and research in the division. And we're grateful for your engagement and support during this inaugural season of virtual faculty lecturers. So thanks again. Have a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you again, whether in person or virtually in the fall.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.